So we're into the last run here for 3/4 of an hour. This is down as a plenary session, and I'm really sorry to say that Professor Larry Hedges is unwell and has had to go back to his hotel. But I'm delighted to say that Steve Higgins
that's no pressure.
Larry Hedges number 2. And I was sorry that he wasn't on one of the earlier discussions, actually, so it just fits in nicely. So I thought that I would just begin by saying a few words myself and try to shift it a bit to the controversial side and open up some new avenues. Then I'll pass across to Dylan and then to Steve, and any heckling will be welcome, and but we'll take questions after that. Let me start off by saying that as far as the evidence from the meta-analyses for classrooms are concerned and for teachers, it's pretty clear that we must never hold teachers to account for anything coming out from meta-analysis. We should never be saying to teachers, you should do this and you should do that. And yet it might contain information which is of use. But where I think we're utterly missing in the research evidence, and I wouldn't blame EEF because they didn't say how to do it, is to do with policy. And let me put it to you that there's been no government policy that has impacted on basic educational success across any Western country in the last 15 years. No government policy has impacted on that. And yet they have made major efforts to make changes. And I say that on the basis of work that we've done in Chem, but also on the basis of an extensive review and case studies by Cesare Alossi, who now is at AQA, suggesting that that's the case. And what it means is that as far as policy is concerned, for things like, should we have Ofsted? Should we actually be testing children on a regular basis? Should we be using league tables? Should we be training teachers in universities or in schools or just put them in the classroom? What about leadership training? How is that influenced by that? In fact, most of those policy questions are completely untouched and the questions unaddressed at the kind of level that we need. And those are the key questions for our nation and actually for our educational system. Everybody else is working within those systems. And when you're looking at a randomized controlled trial, it's one against the other within that system. It's not teasing it out at all. So my plea is to try to get some evidence that would have some relevance to the running of this country and other countries across the developed world. And when I say there's been no impact, actually the PISA results have risen ever so slightly across the Western world. And that exactly corresponds to the rise in socioeconomic status and financial background within the countries. The places where you would see policy is if you build a school in a developing country where there is no school, that has an impact on the children's education. Well, okay, so people actually done randomized controlled trials on such a god-almighty thing. So, but actually to try to find ways to change policy to improve that. What about incentives for teachers? So anyway, there's a whole lot of that stuff on it. And so I want also to just put in the few pennyworth that I've got here, an example that would come out from what advice I would give to teachers on something that you might use within your own school that might come from meta-analysis or elsewhere. And I use as my text for that an academic friend of mine who says when he wants to learn something, he puts on a course on it. Mm-hmm. So if you want to learn something, try and teach it. And that has a parallel within the work within schools on randomized controlled trials. So getting one child to try to teach another child. And what we find is that if you take a child who's struggling with something, they've really found difficulty understanding fractions and they're getting through, the rest of the class have got them, the teachers kept them back to try and teach them, they're not getting through to them, but instead you say to that kid, no, I'm not going to teach you about this anymore. I want you to teach that to this kid who's 2 years younger than you, who also doesn't understand fractions. And that's a complete reversal in that child's mind because they've been treated as a child with special needs and now you're giving them the responsibility. And now you get them to have that younger person and that brings out within them the kind of parental aspect or that brings out the teacher within them and they're given 20 minutes and they're told exactly what to do and go through it. And by teaching it, they learn it. And the child actually also learns it. Now, EEF did a trial on this and it didn't work in the sense that the effect size was 0. But there are many other trials where that's been shown to be effective. And the interesting thing is that we've seen it work for 5-year-olds working with 4-year-olds, where they try to write them a book and read that book to them, right up to PhD students who automatically teach the ones below them. So it's a universal way forward. And if you're looking for something to try out cross-age peer tutoring. But watch out, you're a teacher, and as you try it out and it doesn't seem to be working, stop doing it. And there's the method. Don't persist even though there's evidence behind it. Okay, so two challenges there. So one is that actually the evidence that we've got is okay for teachers, but to take it or leave it and use it as they see fit. The other is we're completely missing on the evidence on policy, and that includes communicating with the policy makers themselves on how to engage with that. And the third is, well, have a look at the different things that are possible and go for cross-age peer tutoring if you can. Okay. Dylan.
Thank you. Very interesting your point about the policy. I had a chat with Baroness Morgan, Labour peer. We actually went to the same secondary school, slightly different times. And so I was chatting to her about this, and I said exactly the same thing. I said, I couldn't think of a single, I actually meant Labour policy, not a single Labour policy that had any impact on student achievement. And she was horrified by this. And I said, okay, so name one. And she couldn't. And so this is really interesting. People always say, well, of course it influences it. And this is why, personally, I've actually stopped working at the policy level. I've tried working at the policy level. The staff don't stay long enough. The politicians don't stay long enough. The priorities change too quickly. That's why I believe in working at the classroom level. And I believe that for quite a while. But I think the thing that keeps on recurring in my head as I listen to these conversations is the thing that Archie Cochrane said in 1972. He talked about the scandalous failure of research to accumulate. And I think we're committing the same problem. How many people here know that in 1995, Ofsted commissioned a series of reviews of research for teachers? Mike Askew and I did the first one in mathematics, and it was a really sobering experience because, first of all, summarize all the research in mathematics education over the last 15 years in 10,000 words. That was about, and we used up all our time on that. And then we worked with teachers, and we had this group of teachers, and we were just bringing it back to them every couple of weeks, and they were saying, "No, sorry, still haven't got a clue what you're talking about." And basically, we spent twice as much time on getting the text into a point where it was meaningful and useful to teachers as we had it in reviewing the research.
What about the Ofsted inspectors? Were they taking notes?
No. I mean, this was basically done from Ofsted head office, and you can look at it as it being people try. It was. Remember, David Hargreaves was pushing for the National Education Research Forum, so all those things were happening at the same time. But the point is, there was a genuine attempt to engage teachers in research in the mid 1990s, and what I'm saying is, all the stuff we're doing now doesn't seem to have built on that or learned from that. So I'm just saying that there's an awful lot of stuff going on that we could probably learn from and think about more systematically about how we can take this forward. The other thing that's occurred to me as I've been listening to the conversation today, and I think this is an area of genuine contention, which is this months of education metric. So I'm a firm believer in the months of education metric because ultimately I think it's the only thing that matters. Because any improvement in education means that children learn faster. That's the only way that you can actually help kids, is to have them learning more amounts of stuff in the same amount of time. So any successful intervention has its effects by speeding up the rate of learning. Now, I accept all the caveats about how hard it is to get that right. And what I find very disappointing is in the current issue of Educational Researcher, a couple of researchers have actually looked at all the ways we might present standardized effect sizes to teachers, and they've opted for things like percentile ranks and norms like that, which are equally incomprehensible, but they work technically. And so for me, I think the major challenge for us is I think it has to be the months of learning metric, and for me, it's in terms of policy, how do we get those policy those measures, those metrics, either more accurate, or how do we bound the inaccuracy so we can actually say don't place too much emphasis on this because this is a very flaky figure. So I think that's a very important point about how we take this work forward. I think that the EEF, the toolkit, made exactly the right decision by not using effect sizes because they're fundamentally meaningless. And there's a lot more judgment bringing in the months of learning metric, but at least then you're talking to teachers at the level that they can understand and people can make smarter decisions. And the other thing is, it supports cost-benefit analyses. And unless you have a months of learning metric, you can't do cost-benefit analyses.
Good. Thanks very much. Steve, you're wrestling with the months of mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very,
as well as the other issues.
that's a very active problem at the moment. I can come on to that if people are interested. I guess I've got several reactions to what you said. First of all, it suggests, horrifyingly, that the economists are right and that all you need to do is improve socioeconomic outcomes, and that's the way you bring about. So that's a slightly terrifying prospect. I think there are some technical issues around how you use evidence at policy level that we've not really fully grappled with. One way of thinking about this is you're not looking at an absolute measure of improvement. You're always looking at what's relative to the existing system. So you're looking at something that's more efficient than the current system. And what policymakers want is they want a silver bullet that will magically make everyone more effective, rather than thinking about efficiency. Now, to do that at policy level, and I'm going to ignore Lee's advice from 7 years ago and talk about standard deviation units, losing 3 standard deviations in my audience. If you think about the progress that you make in a typical trial, an effective trial from EEF, if we're lucky, would have an effect size of about 0.3. So that's a relatively small proportion of the children in the trial who've benefited. So when you take something that's worked at an effect size of 0.3 for about 20% of the population probably, and then you make that policy for everybody in the country to do, it might improve some, but it will make others worse. So in taking an effect size from a particular sample that has had an effect on part of the sample and making everyone do that, you're going to make some worse and some better. And what Nancy's work for me shows is you've got to be really careful about thinking about whether it's going to make it better for all. So I think if you find something that has an effect size of 3, not 0.3, of 3, then yes, probably everyone should do it. But it's that level of effect you need to get to turn something into a policy prescription. So I think we're talking about marginal gains, which means you've got to have contextually nuanced judgments that are relative to context, relative to some sort of diagnosis of need, and that is going to require professional decision making. So I absolutely agree with Dylan. I think evidence-informed policy is highly problematic. We've got to think about evidence-informed practice and the kinds of ways we can support professionals in making decisions to get marginal gains within their setting. And not understanding that, I think, makes the policy world a very difficult area to move in, because they want to take evidence on, okay, let's go for an easy target, phonics. Phonics, we know, is an effective catch-up approach for struggling readers. It's now become the default policy for all readers, which actually isn't warranted by the evidence. And also now, what happens when you want a catch-up strategy? Is phonics going to work when it's the default diet for all? I think that then raises more questions than it answers. So those 2 reasons, I think, that evidence-informed policy is much more problematic than evidence-informed practice, where you can take those other contextual factors into account. And I absolutely agree about accumulation. One of the interesting things about unzipping the meta-analyses that we're currently doing is finding out what are the recurring issues in education that we've tried several times, either found they do or don't work, and then forgotten, and then tried again 20 years later, probably about the length of time of a researcher's career. Researchers like to do new things, and they don't like looking back to see whether they are actually new. So we looked at learning styles in the 1930s, in the 1960s, in the 1980s, and then again early in this century, and each time we've decided it's not an effective way forward. Wait 10, 15 years and we'll try again with learning styles or another version of learning styles. So it's how we embed some of these research-based practices and research knowledge in the system, so the system becomes resilient to educational fads. And that, for me, was part of what we were trying to do with the toolkit.
Steve, let me just take you up on the kind of not evidence-based policy, but rather evidence-based practice. And you picked the example of phonics. it seems to me that example is evidence-based practice, because the phonics is a thing that goes on in the classroom. When I'm talking about policy, I'm talking about whether you should have Ofsted or not, whether you should hold teachers to account with money, whether we should have testing in league tables. So I'm talking about a different kind of thing, and surely we should have evidence on whether we should be running with league tables or not.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, absolutely, although it would be harder to generate robust causal evidence of that at system level. So we need to have quite sophisticated designs to be able to do that. It's not impossible, but when you're looking at generating evidence that at system level across a sufficient sample size, we've got to think quite carefully about the designs that would enable that. And to be fair, I mean, again, another Ofsted example, Ofsted did look at the impact of failing schools in the 1990s before they implemented the policy. They discovered it didn't work in New York, and so implemented it in the UK.
That's Michael Barber's advice.
Unencumbered by the evidence.
Unencumbered by the evidence. So there are all kinds of reasons why it's hard for evidence to get a purchase on the system. And we need multiple strategies to embed it institutionally, professionally, in training, in practices, in ways that the system is then able to progress positively. Whole loads of other policies we could have a pop at. But
I think that Steve's right. I think phonics is a policy question simply because the Teacher Training Agency, Teacher Development Agency has decided that if you're training primary school teachers, you have to teach them to be able to use a phonics-based approach, and that is not true for any other approach to reading. So it has been translated into policy, and so I think that it is a policy-relevant question, not maybe in the same way as league tables, but I think there's always a policy dimension to these things, especially when the government says you're not allowed to train teachers unless you train them in this particular way.
How they all have to sit the test as well. That's a system level thing, sure.
Yeah.
So let's take questions or comments. Let's take 2 or 3 and then see if there's more to come from there. Yes.
How would you test whether league tables are effective rigorously? You could do. I think Wales was a sort of control, wasn't it? Because they scrapped it at some point when we still had it on. But that's messy. How do you do that?
Okay. Let's just park that one for the moment. That's how would you investigate league tables? Any other comments? Yes.
In I think it's South Korea, it's been quite common for academics to hold quite senior posts in education policy making. So if we did the same thing here and had you 3 in charge, what would be different? What would you do?
Okay, thank you. So that's the second one. Any other third one to go with that? Yes.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of these comments. I mean, under the Blair government, we had sort of policy-informed evidence. They would seek the evidence to defend their policies. And so you had another twist on this, a bit like the Campbell's law writ large. But just on that trauma comment, one of the things I thought about was maybe you try, and we would never have like the Bank of England, you would have a separate agency that would oversee a long-term education strategy that was outside of the Whitehall, and that would look at evidence. But would that ever be possible? I don't know.
Right, an outside agency, so almost like EEF upgraded.
A more strategic oversight of education.
Like NICE? Like NICE?
But with informing policy, but I don't know how I guess, are there any other countries that do that, I suppose the question would be.
Okay, so we've got how would you investigate league tables? We've got what would you do if you were on the policy making of the country, and should we have a body outside?
I mean, league tables, I think, it's not difficult. What you do is you randomise local authorities to actually have league tables, and you do a wait list control. Right. So basically, it's how much political capital are you willing to spend to get the answer to your question? And many politicians will say it's not worth it. But I think a lot of these things are not technically difficult. You also do A/B testing. So, for example, when league tables were first introduced, I don't know if you remember this story, but it's quite an interesting story about policymaking. I think it was the Evening Standard got hold of the results of London schools. And they were about to publish them, and I think it might have been Peter Mortimer, who was head of the Research and Statistics branch at ILIA at the time. They actually managed to get the newspaper to wait until they could actually do it themselves. So they basically produced more contextualized results. And so I think that idea, you could actually produce league tables, and you have two different sorts. In half of the authorities, they are listing the schools alphabetically by name, and in the other half, they list them by results. And so the question is, does that make a difference? Because you could investigate those kinds of questions, and I think that would be quite interesting A/B type testing. And I think that what is interesting is that it's not the releasing of the results that was the real problem. It was the fact, and if you looked from the first printed versions, and if anybody remembers that, there were these boxes of booklets, and they were alphabetical. And so it was very difficult for anybody to do this kind of league table stuff, because you could look at the results of any school you wanted to, but you couldn't actually see who was top without going through every single one of the books. And so you can do things in a way that encourage facile comparisons, and you can do things in a way that make it much more difficult. Now, with the information technology age we're in now, that's all more, everything's much easier to do like that. But I still think some thought about how do you support people using these sources of information in smart ways might be useful as a way of getting some insight into those kinds of questions.
And if you were on the government's policymakers?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I tell you what I would do. I think I would give everybody a 5-year rest. So basically, I would just say, just get on with it. And I think, taking information from international comparisons is just a ludicrous game. But if I try to figure out one thing that has been good for countries that have been successful in improving their education systems, I think the only conclusion I can draw is that they don't mess about with the education system. So if you look at what ties South Korea, Shanghai, Singapore, Finland together, it's people actually setting a very small number of broad policy parameters and then letting the system get on with it. And I think maybe that's giving people a rest would be my recipe. Masterful inactivity.
So I'll take the next one, Steve, it's all right, and then I'll pass on to you. And what I would do is put all three together, all those 3 points. And I would go back to Donald Campbell, that people will have heard who studied education from maybe Campbell and Fisk, or maybe Campbell and Stanley, or maybe the Campbell collaboration. And he wrote a great paper at one point called Reforms as Experiments. So he said that policymakers don't know what the impact of their policies are going to be. They don't like U-turns, but actually, if we think about reforms as experiments, reforms that are designed to make a change, but we're prepared to change as a result of what appears to be the impact of our policies. So I would go for that kind of mindset, which goes for reforms as experiment, and I would do that if I was in a policy position. And also, if I was in a policy position, I would try to depoliticize the way the things run. So we're beset by a Secretary of State for Education to make his mark within 6 months, 3 months, and then on. And so they want to get their name like Belisha on Belisha beacons, and they want to do it by creating something that's going to last forever. You've seen it from time and time again, and we pick up the pieces years later. So try to depoliticize the education, and the way that I would do that is to try to set up a body, as is suggested, that would act as a repository for advice coming into the advisors. So I would use the mindset of Campbell's reforms as experiments. I'd set up another body, and I would try to back off and prevent the Secretary of State from making them. They should be able to make broad strategic judgments. But the idea that they should have some say on what phonics is, or how this is done or that's done, is just ridiculous. They don't know anything about it, and they're doing enormous damage.
Can I just add a footnote there? I remember having a conversation with a very high-flying civil servant when he was at the Department of Education, and he was telling me that if he did well in education, his next stop would be the Treasury, and if he did badly, it was DEFRA. So it's not just the politicians; it's also the civil servants.
It's also the civil servants. It's the mindset. Okay, Steve.
Yeah, I'll continue that theme with perhaps a slightly cynical note. I think we certainly have to diminish the political capital that politicians get from being able to make sound bites in education. Because until we can change that, they're not going to release their grip on education, because it's an easy win, or they perceive it as an easy win with the electorate. They can make pronouncements that they think will win them votes. So how do we get a more informed public, more informed parents, that become sceptical of those kinds of pronouncements? And then, yes, we want some kind of arm's length body. I think probably you want a series of those responsible for curriculum and testing would need to be separate. You wouldn't want those designing the curriculum to be the ones who design the tests. So you'd need some productive tension or dissonance in how that was regulated, I think. That would lock the system into relative immobility, which would be, I think, probably a good thing, because that would then allow teachers and professionals to work in the space created by those organizations. So I say that's a slightly cynical view, but I think in the long run, if we are going to kind of re-establish professionalism and professional decision making, which has underpinned a lot of our assessments today, the complexity of what we do in schools is simply too complex, too hectic to be able to make easy external pronouncements. That has to be the long-term future that we aspire to. But how we clear the political arena to achieve that, I think is very difficult with our current electoral system, and with the rise of things like Twitter and headlines, and there's, I think, been an increased drive for politicians to make those sound bites.
Well, maybe we could try it in America and see if we can stop Trump tweeting.
Can I say, I mean, we've talked several times here about the purpose of education, and we've all said that one of the problems here is that we don't have any consensus about what the purpose of education is. And I think one of the things that I've tried to be fairly careful to do in my own work is not to actually push any particular view of what education is for. I mean, I have my own views, but I see my own work as basically trying to help teachers do better whatever it is that they want to do. Because every teacher negotiates. You know, you've got a national curriculum, you've got kids who need to pass tests, you've got preparing kids for their future. Every teacher has to make compromises in their classrooms about what they're trying to do. So I don't know what compromises each teacher is going to make, and I can't make those compromises for them. So I think it would be very much more helpful if, in taking this work forward, we take as our goal not helping teachers do X or Y and have a particular view about what we think education is for, but see our job as helping teachers do better whatever it is that they have decided they want to do. I think that would be a big step forward.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take three more points if we've got any from here. Yes, go on, Lee.
Is there a danger with meta-analyses and the sort of testing regime that we have, that we tend to look at the things that are measurable in the classroom to the detriment of all the other things? And again, I'm not making judgments about what education is for, but there's a lot more to what happens in the classroom than just improving test grades. So is there a danger that this whole debate focuses on that one outcome?
Okay, any more? Yes.
Yeah, just to say I agree with that point about professional learning, which I think is very strong in your work. And I just wondered, how could we make that more consistent across the board? Because we know that if you do get professional learning, that you can actually bring about some significant changes. So it's improving the teacher in the classroom.
Yes.
Can we do that?
Yes.
More consistent.
Any others? Yes.
Laura.
Just to add on to that, how can we improve our education of researchers so that
Right.
we're not having
Okay.
to, have these same discussions time and time again? Because often for researchers, the question is that difficult one of what do we not know that we do not know?
Yeah. What was your experience when you started research? Were you given good courses? Would you not make the mistakes that we've heard of repeating the things that Steve talked about and that Larry talked about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people who taught me are in this room.
Feel free to criticise.
Diplomatically and honestly as well, I think I was well prepared to really be self-aware of where my limitations were, and to know that I would benefit from speaking to people if I had a research design, for example, to make sure that I knew what the gaps in it were.
Right.
Which has made me less confident, let's say, but more careful with what I do. So I would hope that if I were to do a meta-analysis, I would have read all of these papers.
Yeah. Okay. I do think there's a real problem with the training of education researchers in the UK, probably elsewhere. I think maybe Germany is a good deal better, and parts of the Netherlands are a lot better, and maybe you could find good pathways in the United States. But we certainly, you could go to a university and never hear any talk of certain methods at all, and then you would get a job which expects you to do that kind of thing, and that's appalling. I don't know, Dylan, is there a solution to this?
Well, I mean, I think this debate came up very sharply when, in the late 1990s, we put together a specialist doctorate, and we had to go through the University of London's regulations. So there's a working group from the Institute, from King's, and from Goldsmiths. And one of the things we articulated, well, why have a specialist doctorate rather than just a PhD? And I think the point we came up with was the specialist doctorate would be more for the consumer of research, and the PhD would be for the producer of research. So I think it's okay if you wanted to be a researcher to actually study very narrowly the kinds of things that you want to research. I mean, I think it's a limited model, but I think that lots of people quite like the British PhD in that sense, that you can actually know a lot about a very small thing and not, for example, develop any expertise in quantitative methods because you think of yourself as a qualitative researcher. But I think the EdD that we designed was actually pretty good in giving people a broad swathe of knowledge. And I think this has come up several times already today, which is that what we need is people who can take the knowledge that's there and actually not necessarily be the original authors of that research, but to make sense of that research and bring it together in a way that is accessible to teachers. And I think that what we would therefore need to do is to change the incentives within the academy so that we see that as genuinely important scientific work. And so basically, you get just as much credit for writing a good synthesis of research, and in a way that and it moves the system forward. And many universities have that criterion already, because you can get a professorship in many universities for the advancement of the discipline. And if a discipline is public engagement in research, then that would be an advancement of the discipline. So I think we could do a lot better in that area. In terms of the point that Lee made, I mean, I think that for me, one of the things we have to get over to people is that RCTs, randomized controlled trials, prioritize one particular threat to valid interpretations. So when I work on this with teachers, I talk about the but what if? So I think that these results mean this, but what if? What if the control group and the experimental group weren't matched? Well, we randomized them. So the RCTs settle one particular but what if. But as Nancy has pointed out, there are other but what ifs, which is, what if both of the groups in the experiment are not representative of the groups you want to apply this to? So I think we have to, what we need to be doing is, rather than saying there's RCTs and there's everything else, I think we need to be saying RCTs just have this status because they have canonized one particular threat to valid interpretations and they've ignored all the others. And I think we have to say that to get the others on a par.
But what about the outcomes which are not easily measurable? Is that your answer to that?
That's also the same. It's to say, basically, yes, you got this result by only focusing on these outcomes rather than the other outcomes. Okay. And so basically, it's prioritizing one particular kind of outcome because they're easily measurable, and we understand that. But the point is, it's basically seeing. I come back to this thing that I'm now talking more and more about. It's trade-offs. And there are trade-offs in everything in education. And if you don't know what the trade-offs are, you haven't looked carefully enough. So if you think that RCTs are very good, what are the trade-offs? And if you can't tell me what the trade-offs are, then you don't really understand this. And so basically, what are you giving up by adopting this method? That, I think, is always a good question to ask a researcher.
And any further comment on the professional learning that we got from you? I mean, you already mentioned that. I've been trying really hard for 40 years. So I'm not sure.
I think it comes down to creating an ethos where teachers feel they need to improve, and therefore not grading them, but just saying creating an ethos in the school where every teacher feels they need to get better. And also an expectation that you will improve on things that matter in terms of outcomes for children, which is how I head off things like teachers wanting to work on brain gym or learning styles. So I think that's where the research comes in. The research, as people have spoken about already, will help you identify the best bets. So basically, the research says this is probably a productive area for you to work in. This is probably an unproductive area for you to work in. But even then, I would always allow the teachers the chance to reject that. So ability grouping, the toolkit says it's negative. Yes, but we know why it's negative. It's negative because all the best teachers were given to the top kids, and they benefit those kids much less than they benefit the lowest achieving kids. So we're going to do it in a different way. we want to do teaching assistants. It has no impact. But, in fact, we know why it didn't have any impact. The teaching assistants were deployed thoughtlessly. We have some better ideas about that. So I think that all the research evidence does for the practitioner is create a kind of balance of evidence test. And if the research says this is not very good and this is good, then you better have strong evidence for why you think that you should do something different. And I think that for me would be the test. It's an invitation into a conversation. And that's the kind of thing that Lawrence Stenhouse was talking about 40 years ago. Basically, that teachers need to be involved in all these activities because no educational intervention can be implemented in classrooms in the way intended by the designer. Teachers always have to mediate this, and they have to be involved in that process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did just kind of pick that up, and that's been one of the hardest messages I think about the toolkit to get across, is that the kind of language of best bets is this is the best bet, but if you want to go for a risky bet and you have a good rationale and logic model as to why you think that's a better bet for you, then that absolutely has to be acceptable. And it's the other kind of point I make around that is that if you look at something that tends to work on average, you've only got to do it averagely well and you'll probably succeed. Whereas if you choose something that most people fail on, you're going to have to do it exceptionally well to make it work. And provided you're aware that that's the challenge, I think that's an appropriate framework to discuss how you interpret the evidence. I think at the moment we're at an unfortunate time in education where, if you like, all the dominoes stack up around a narrow set of quantitative indicators. It was one of my, certainly argument, has been one of my arguments with Ofsted over the last few years, although we are seeing some change, because that creates a very narrow set of quantity drivers in education. And we've ended up with a system in England where they're all neatly aligned. All of the systems and processes align around those narrow indicators. And we don't have quality drivers that look at the quality of education that children experience in the classroom. At one time, HMI used to focus much more on the quality of the way they perceived judgment-based views of what happened in classrooms. So I don't know how we broaden the range of indicators. I wouldn't want simply to increase targets in geography, history, and create league tables, although that might be one way. How many league tables could we create to make it impossible to work out who was top? I mean, that might be one solution. But how do we get that kind of quality? How do we get wider goals and outcomes from education valued in a way without measuring them? Because we know if we measure them, the Campbell's law, same Campbell you mentioned, will kick in, and that they will no longer retain their validity of measures within the system. And we know that. So we know these problems, but we're stuck in a system that it's very hard to change from the inside. In terms of professional learning, I think that is one of the solutions, although I absolutely take Dylan's point that it's been hard to change. We've got to see professional learning as a continuum rather than this cliff edge at qualification where you suddenly become qualified. It's a bit like passing a driving test. You're never going to improve again, or there's no incentive to improve again. Well, we don't want that as a goal for professional learning. It has to be a minimum standard, and then an expectation that you continue to develop and extend your knowledge of pedagogy, of subject, of assessment over a professional career. And again, how we do that, I think, is really challenging within the current ecology with the very narrow set of drivers that tend to force action. But that's again why I think professional control has to be the way forward for the profession. There are some encouraging signs, both within the system, the Chartered College, but also within Ofsted, that there may be some scope to create that professional space. The challenge will be when the rest of the ecology kind of comes back in and tries to close down that space again. So seeing this as a system and working out what the drivers are and how the system responds, I think we've got to be more sophisticated in the way we understand change.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just make a few comments about the difficult to measure, and then we'll kind of wrap up there. Lord Kelvin said around 1900 that if something exists, it exists in some amount and can be measured. And I think that if we're trying to get impact on something that we say can't be measured, we might be deluding ourselves about its existence. And I think that actually by trying to measure, we try to understand the construct. Mm-hmm. So part of the reason for measuring is to try to get a handle on what it is that we're trying to understand. And if you took something like creativity, which seems to fall between your fingers, it's because you tried to measure it. Maybe we should be measuring this part of it or that part of it, or not trying. So it's defining the construct and get a hold of the measure. And I think that there are some very interesting bits of work going on, for example, on education impacting on personality, not in 5 minutes, but over 2 or 3 years. But EEF necessarily has to focus. It's focused just on a couple of small areas and hasn't finished the job yet. So it's a big job ahead of us. Well, I'm going to wrap up and ask people to thank people here, but let me just mention before I do that Stuart Kime has just been awarded the Queen's Award for Industry for his work. And I should mention also that Lee was on Radio 4 this morning talking about inequality. So maybe you could thank everybody, including the panel, and those achievers.